When I was a kid, I grew up basically in the middle of the woods. I was always climbing trees, I was jumping in lakes, I was mixing it up with bugs, all of the stuff that kids do. And I never really questioned the inextricable connection between humans and the natural world. But then when I moved out, I moved to a series of cities. So New York, Mexico City, London, and I started to realize as I was living in these cities, the ways in which the capitalist system separates us as much as possible from the natural world. It builds a structure on top of it that's based on domination. Now, if we experience nature, we tend to experience it through parks or manicured lawns or very carefully planned hiking activities. Enter Murray Bookchin. Murray Bookchin was an anarchist, he was an iconoclast, he was a guy who clashed very publicly with Bernie Sanders, who he accused of being insufficiently radical. He was a man who never doubted humanity's ability to build and create culture and society, but thought that it could be balanced with what he called first nature. He argued vociferously through books and papers and hundreds of pages in this book here for his concept of social ecology, which is all based around the idea that our destruction and devastation of the natural world has nothing to do with technology or human population expanding. It's humans' domination over other humans that lead to man's domination of nature. It's a radical vision for a completely different way to live our lives, to structure our societies, and that is why I am so excited to introduce his magnum opus. That's this book that I'm holding in my hand. This is the Ecology of Freedom. Chances are, if you're a committed leftist, you may have heard this book mentioned before. If you have not heard this book before, then I am genuinely excited for you because the ideas that are contained in this book are fascinating. Now, I do not agree with all of them, but they are nonetheless fantastic. And this book is such an important book to read, especially now. And I know I say this every single time we start a new book, but this is the perfect moment to be reading a book like The Ecology of Freedom and to be appreciating the words of Murray Bookchin. You know, Bookchin, he says himself in this book that he wanted with this text to turn the world upside down. So welcome to Champagne Anarchism. Welcome back. If you are new to this channel, my name is Justin. We read on this channel fabulous works of leftist literature. We have done some unbelievable books on here, things like Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, things like Arundhati Roy's Capitalism, a Ghost Story. We just finished up Eduardo Galeano's Open Veins of Latin America, which was a just brilliant read. And now we are starting with a brand new book. Well, not exactly brand new. This book came out in 1982, the first version, and then was republished a couple times. We'll talk about that later on in this series. But this book is our first foray into ecology. And I'm using the word ecology advisedly. Instead of environmentalism, we talk about ecology. And we'll talk a little bit about Bookchin's distinction between those two later. But yes, my name is Justin. We read leftist books on this channel. And if you want the full series, you can check that out on YouTube. You can also go to the free Patreon where you will get a full series available and all the past versions, all the past books that we've done. That's patreon.com/Champagne Anarchism. So I hope you go there, you join the chat. There is a paid version, but for all of this like main feed book stuff, all of that is freely available to all. I'm not interested in gatekeeping this information. I just think it's fabulous. And I think that the more people who want to engage with this, the better. So definitely please go check out that Patreon. Check out any of my social media channels. Please like, subscribe, all of that good stuff. Today, I will be giving an introduction video to this fabulous book, and we will be talking about it in a few different ways. But as soon as we get past the intro video, we will get into reading this book, and we'll be reading it 2 chapters per week. I know that's a big commitment. This is not an easy book to read. We'll talk about that too, but this is not an easy book to get into. When we talk about Murray Bookchin, he can be very, very dense and very, very academic and very, very philosophical. And he will lean on words that you'll just say, why? Why on earth would you use this word instead of that word? What are we doing here? I get it. However, spending 12 weeks going through Murray Bookchin seemed a little bit of an insane project to me, so I wanted to slim it down a little bit, make it a little bit more understandable. So if you can't make, 2 chapters per week, I absolutely understand that. Please read this at your own pace, whatever works for you. At the end of this series, there will also be a video that's just a general introduction, everything you need to know in the Ecology of Freedom. That will be at the end of the 6 weeks that we use to break down all of these chapters. So if you don't have time to read this book for whatever reason, I absolutely understand, but there will be a final video that will sum all of this up, and that will be available on the Patreon feed as well, probably to paying subscribers, but if you are interested and you can't afford the fees for whatever reason, let me know and I will send you that directly. If you are already subscribed to the Patreon, thank you so much. I love you very much. This is really helpful in helping me to keep this series going and making these books available to all. So I really appreciate that membership. Thank you so much. Now, as we get into the introduction here, this is a little bit about how to approach this book, how to read the book, and necessary background. So we're going to go through this in a few sections. First of all, we'll talk about literally how to read the Ecology of Freedom. I'll give you a couple kind of tips and strategies and general things about how to tackle this book. It's a little intimidating, but it doesn't have to be. Second, we'll go through Murray Bookchin's biography, who he was as a thinker, who he was as a person. We'll talk a little bit about the evolution of his thought, because he starts as a Marxist and then he goes to anarchism, and then he, at the end of his life, kind of renounces anarchism. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. Third, we'll go through some historical context. So we are talking about mostly the 1970s here. This book comes, as I said, in 1982, but I think the really relevant context is the burgeoning environmental movement that starts taking place in the 1970s. This is when Greenpeace is doing their badass stuff out, trying to stop whaling ships and stuff like that. This is when the environmental movement really takes off. And so it's in that context that Bookchin is writing, even though this book doesn't actually come around until literally the Reagan administration. And then we will finish this intro lecture with some themes, which are sort of relevant things to know as you go in to read this book. And I'm just looking at my list here. We are talking about Libertarian Municipalism, which is a phrase I really hate, but it's an interesting idea. We are going to talk about first nature, second nature, and social ecology, some of these distinctions that he makes. We are going to talk about environmentalism versus ecology, which I already mentioned a little bit about already. We're going to talk about Murray Bookchin's concept of freedom. We're going to talk about biocentrism, and then we're going to talk about his struggle with Marx and Marxism, and we are going to end this lecture on the idea of the peaceful or the noble savage. And if you come from the world of cultural criticism, or you read a lot of cultural criticism, or maybe you've engaged with thinkers before like Edward Said, you may know a little bit already about this notion of the peaceful or noble savage, which is very, very important, I think, when we start to pick apart and criticize this book. But we'll get to all that. Thank you again for being here, and let's get right into it. And firstly, let's talk about how to read this book. I have the AK Press version of this book, which I really like. I like this edition because it includes a few introductions that have popped up through time. You can also get a free copy as well of the entirety of Ecology of Freedom on the anarchistlibrary.org. That's all freely available online. You can just go there. You can literally download a copy if you have an e-reader to any device, so that's really awesome. So, but I like physical versions, and I really like this AK Press version particularly. Now, it is 500 pages, and it is dense. It is maybe the most challenging book that we've read so far on this channel. Do not be intimidated by that. It's just awesome. It's a challenge I think that's really worthy of embarking on. However, let's talk a little bit about the academic language and the approach that you can use. If you ask me personally, I like the idea of Eduardo Galeano, the author that we just read, who hates the type of leftist who uses this really arcane, really difficult to understand language to write things that Galeano thinks maybe they don't necessarily even understand fully themselves. Clearly, Bookchin is not one of those writers, but he does often lean on this leftist arcane language, really academic, really wordy, dense stuff where he repeats stuff a lot and maybe hammers his point home in a way that feels very indirect to us. That happens kind of a lot in this book, and that's absolutely fine, but it will be annoying, and especially if you read through Open Veins of Latin America with us last time, this is the opposite of Open Veins of Latin America. Open Veins of Latin America is fiery and angry and passionate, and this book is cold and thoughtful and academic, and so they are radically different things. So, my first piece of advice is to take it slow. Forgive yourself. If you read and reread sentences or passages, that's absolutely fine. This is a thing that you really have to sit with and pick apart. This is written very consciously in a grand, sweeping leftist style. This is an emulation of thinkers like Karl Marx and Mikhail Bakunin and Peter Kropotkin. These thinkers who would Kropotkin's maybe not such a good example, but these are thinkers who will write passionately, but also clinically, also with a very particular type of language. And this is what Bookchin is setting out to write. He wants a great work that is going to stand the test of time, and the language goes along with that idea. So take it slow, grant yourself some grace, you will get the hang of it as you go through. Second, and I say this every time, but read it with a notebook. My notebook is right here, and the strategy that I use for this notebook is I'll write down all the main stuff as I'm going through and as much as I can of the main thoughts and ideas, and then I'll pepper in questions and I'll use different colors. So if something's in red, it will be something I disagree with or something I will think critically of, and I will go through those and write those notes just as a way of reminding myself, hey, this strikes me as not quite right. Let me come back to this idea, especially as I'm going to record these videos. I'll remind myself of what didn't I agree with in here. And then if something is in blue or in green, and I'm missing those pens right now, but if something's in blue or green, it will be something that does agree with the thrust of the text, but will be my own addition, my own sort of idea. I'll be like, oh, this is interesting. It reminds me of this. These can really help to connect some ideas to other ideas, and that's really helpful and really cool. And especially when you're reading a book like this, it is really, really helpful to have past chapter notes to go back to and be like, when he was talking about first nature, second nature, social ecology, what was he talking about? When he mentioned that thing about freedom, what was he saying there? This is really, really helpful to have a notebook on hand. And as with all these books, the notebook is just part of it. If you're comfortable marking up your physical copy, go for it. For all the books that I really love, I will go in, I will write stuff on the margins, I will scribble all over them, I will highlight them, everything. Dog ears, post-it notes, all of that stuff can be really, really helpful to just, genuinely take apart a book. And you may need to take this book apart. Third piece of advice: be skeptical. This is a book that was written mostly in the 1970s, and a lot of things have not aged very well. You will catch them. So read with a little bit of a critical eye. And one other thing, when I talk about the strategy to read this, if you have my version of the book, the AK Press version, it comes with a few prefaces. So it comes with acknowledgments, a preface, an introduction to the 1991 edition, and an introduction to the original edition. The thing about these introductions, which we will not be covering in these videos, I will make some references to them, but there won't be a specific video about the introduction, for example. The thing about these introductions is that they are sort of skippable. The preface is skippable. The introduction contains a lot of stuff that is then repeated throughout the book. You don't need to sit and read through the introduction, which is only about 20 pages or so. What I would recommend, however, is that if you have the time, read the introduction to the 1991 edition. It is fascinating. It's really, really interesting. And it's Bookchin arguing with a lot of his critics and really taking aim as well. We'll talk a little bit about this actually in this lecture, but taking aim against biocentrism. And also the idea that there is something sort of mystical and magical about the earth. Bookchin does not like this idea, and he really takes aim at that in the 1991 introduction. As I say, we'll talk about that in just a little bit here. But first, let's go through Murray Bookchin, who he was, his biography. Let's talk about it. Murray Bookchin was born in 1921 to a Russian Jewish family in the Bronx. The Bronx is a borough of New York City, if you're not familiar. He grew up during the Great Depression, and that means that he was very much growing up around the working class struggle and the radical politics, which was especially prevalent in the New York and in the immigrant neighborhoods of his time. And so by the time he was a teenager, he was actually quite radical. So as a teenager, he joins the Young Communist League. He starts reading Karl Marx, but he actually becomes disillusioned quite quickly with Marxism. Because in his 20s, and this is World War II, this is a really brutal period in history, but in his 20s, he starts working as a foundryman and an auto worker. He was actually part of the United Auto Workers Union, which is still around and still fighting. But they held a very public strike against General Motors that happens in 1948. Now, that strike is actually fairly successful. They win a couple things. They win some cost of living adjustments that come on a quarterly basis. They win health insurance that's covered by the company, a couple other guarantees, but it's this strike that kind of radicalizes Bookchin against his Marxist roots and starts pushing him in the direction of anarchism, because what he has realized during the course of this strike is that if you expect, as Karl Marx does, but if you expect the revolution to start with the working class, these people who are just fighting to survive and trying to live in a world that's categorically against them, the working class is not going to lead your revolution. The working class will typically fight for better conditions under the capitalist system. And if you're looking for a real challenge to the capitalist system, Bookchin starts to think, actually, this needs to be much broader. You can't put the burden of the revolution exclusively on the working class. And so he starts to think and develop his ideas here. And what he comes up with is that if you want to resist capitalism, it needs to be done on a community basis. And this is the idea that will eventually snowball into Libertarian Municipalism, which we will get to in a little bit. But he's looking for issues that cut across class divisions and can be opposed by basically everyone in a society or in a community anyway. And one of the things that he starts to come up with, and this long predates the ecological environmentalist movement of the 1960s and 1970s. But what he starts to come up with is ecology. And it's also during this period that he starts to identify more as an anarchist. And this is sort of the driving thread of his philosophy, anarchism. Now, in the 1950s, after the war, he starts to study ecology and to try to find this connection between capitalist exploitation and ecological degradation. In the 1960s, he starts becoming very involved with a lot of grassroots movements, the anti-nuclear campaign, which is really taking off in the 1960s. Also, of course, the anti-war protests against Vietnam. And if you remember our Noam Chomsky chat from the Manufacturing Consent book that we did quite a while, or last year, actually. But for Manufacturing Consent, this is also when Noam Chomsky starts to step down off his pedestal at MIT and starts joining the anti-war effort. These were some really galvanizing protests. Bookchin is exactly the same. It's during this period that he co-founds the Institute for Social Ecology up in Vermont, and he starts teaching students both theory, but also kind of practical skills for building communities. It's really, really interesting, his work that he does at the university. Later in life, Bookchin becomes very much an inspiration for a number of radical movements, and one of the biggest, and the one you may know, is Rojava, which is a Kurdish-led anarchist movement that's right next to Syria. And the Rojavan sort of direct communal democracy ideas, all of that comes from Murray Bookchin. Now, Rojava is still a project that is still very much ongoing. It's kind of a test of Bookchin's theories in real life. We will talk about this a little bit more towards the end of this series of videos, so not so much in this introduction lecture, but if you want to read something alongside Murray Bookchin's Ecology of Freedom, read a little bit about what's going on with Rojava right now. It's really, really fascinating, the stuff that's happening there. Now, it is very important to mention, as with any modern thinker, or actually any thinker at all, Murray Bookchin is a controversial figure. And one of the big things, especially now, I'm recording this video in 2025, but one of the big things is that he was a defender of Zionism. He was if not the most committed Zionist, at least forgiving of Israeli war crimes. And he didn't write too much about this, especially relative to his other work with ecology and with anarchism and social ecology, all of this stuff. But when he did write about Israel, it was very much on the side of Zionism. He could also be incredibly caustic in his writing and made enemies very, very easily. He was, at the end of his life, so disillusioned with the anarchist movement and where it was going that he renounced anarchism himself. And started really pushing his idea of libertarian municipalism, which, to be honest, I would consider a sort of anarchism itself. But listen, we can talk about that a little bit as well. But it bears mentioning that towards the end of his life, he very much broke with the anarchist movement in general. Now, I think, just like any other thinker that we talk about on this channel, you have to take the good with the bad. These are not perfect people. They never will be. There will always be a degree of hypocrisy in Emma Goldman's writings. There will always be a sort of deep confusion in the work of Frantz Fanon. And with Bookchin, it's very, very similar. Does his Zionism make our reading of social ecology, his social ecologist writings, any different? Maybe they should. I don't know the answer to that. To me, I think you can still take things of tremendous value from his writing, and especially from a book like The Ecology of Freedom. I think there's a lot of tremendous stuff in here, but you also have to understand that he was controversial for a reason, and he had opinions that I certainly do not agree with, and I don't know many committed leftist thinkers who really do. In any case, Bookchin died in Burlington, Vermont in 2006, and he left quite a legacy. And we will be getting into that legacy in this series. But first, let's talk about the historical context. Let's talk about the 1960s and 1970s. Now, as I say, Ecology of Freedom, it was published in 1982, so it's worth talking a little bit about the ecological and environmentalist movement leading up to that publication date. So we're mostly talking about the 1970s, and the 1970s were a pretty wild time. We're talking lots of grassroots struggle, lots of grassroots activism, lots of political awakening, some passionate activism, all of that good stuff. So in the 1960s, you had civil rights, you had anti-war protests, you had the counterculture that really shaped the generations that were to come. And in the 1970s, when they rolled around, people were, I think, my opinion, potentially primed to incorporate ecology and the environment into their thinking and their movements. And actually, there was one big spark that happened right at the start of the decade. This was the first celebration of Earth Day in the US, which now I think nobody really takes Earth Day quite seriously. But back then, 20,000 people went out to celebrate, to take part in this celebration of the Earth and this day of activism. And it was an incredibly meaningful thing that started right at the beginning of the 1970s. And you also get the feeling among a lot of people that their world is starting to decay in very important ways, and that's not accidental. So in the late 1960s, early 1970s, you have a number of very high-profile disasters. So things like Cleveland's Cuyahoga River, which started burning. This is the River of Fire. Los Angeles is being choked with smog. You have an enormous oil spill of historic proportions, literally, in Santa Barbara. And in 1962, the decade previously, there was a very, very famous book that came out by Rachel Carson, which is Silent Spring. You've probably heard of this book before. It remains one of the most incredible books ever written about toxic environment that's created by industrialization and corporations, especially when it comes to pesticides. Silent Spring, written in 1962, still an important read. Anyway, in that environment, that sort of environmental pressure cooker of the 1970s, you get the rise of this sort of very small, very militant group called Greenpeace. And back then, Greenpeace, now Greenpeace does a lot of good stuff, which I think is awesome. Back then, Greenpeace was a lot more badass. Greenpeace would sail tiny boats in front of whaling ships and block nuclear testing sites and stuff like that. When Greenpeace was doing some stuff, it was incredibly controversial, but it did actually put a lot of pressure. That plus the public's activism, it put a lot of pressure and actually led to some real changes in legislation. So notably, you get Richard Nixon's Clean Air Act that comes around in 1970. You get the Clean Water Act, which is 1972. You get the Endangered Species Act in 1973. And the EPA was also created in 1970 before that, which is some real advancement. We also need to spend a little bit of time talking about the confluence of people that are coming together to fight these battles. So Bookchin had this idea, right, that ecology and environmentalism really cuts across class structures. It really cuts across and affects everybody. And so you may get to build bigger coalitions with that. And that is absolutely what was happening at the time. So throughout the 1970s and up into the present day, you had indigenous activists, you had ecofeminists, you had black activists, you had multiple groups kind of coming together and linking the ecological struggle with the struggle for broader social justice. And all of this, I mean, this book is being written in this environment of real profound changes in our attitudes towards environmentalism, but of course that was not to last. Midway through the 1970s, there's a massive energy crisis, and that really gives a lot of fuel to corporations to frame environmentalism and environmentalists and these activists as the enemies of business in the United States, and that is incredibly powerful. And from there, it's just a slow march to the present day, which is when you see a ton of environmental regulations being rolled back. You see climate change denial holding really, really strong. All of that began at the end of the 1970s, and especially in 1980, when Ronald Reagan wins the presidency. And 2 years after Reagan wins, you have Bookchin, and he comes out with the Ecology of Freedom. So that's when this book is published. And now let's get into some major themes. The first theme to talk about is libertarian municipalism. And by the way, there is a distinction between European libertarianism and American libertarianism. American libertarianism is not real. It is a manufactured ideology that was spread by people like the John Bircher Society and the Koch brothers and all of that. And if you want more information about that, you can read Jane Mayer's incredible book, Dark Money, which traces all of that history and all of that influence. It's just a brilliant book. That's American libertarianism. It's nonsense. European libertarianism is the old way we used to call anarchism. It's the exact same thing. So libertarian municipalism is referring to the European version, not the American version. Libertarian municipalism is Bookchin's governing philosophy. It's his theory of change. It's his idea for how to structure society in a way that marries anarchism to the realities of modern globalization. And the idea is actually pretty simple. Return power to localities, to municipalities, to local communities to make their own decisions. So those municipalities, those little communities, they make all decisions through direct democracy. Everyone votes. If there is an issue that affects the community, and we're talking a very small community, everybody makes that decision by general consensus. Now, in the larger structure of municipalities, so if there's an issue that affects a region, all of those municipalities will elect someone who is mandated to do the will of the municipality and recallable, so they can be recalled at any time, but they elect somebody to go to a confederation council that's set up just on the spur of the moment for that particular issue and then vanishes to make those decisions. And those decisions are made by confederation. So it's a confederation council that's very loose and ever-changing. This is actually a direct answer to some versions of political change that come about through the takeover of enterprises. So if you're a socialist, you may talk about the nationalization of a particular enterprise. If you are an anarchist, an anarcho-syndicalist is what they're called, you may talk about the takeover of an enterprise by the workers. So completely horizontal structure, and the enterprise, the business, is run by and for the workers. And that's the theory of political change that will lead to an anarchist society. Bookchin says, listen, they're still enterprises. You're still operating in the capitalist system. What you need is to cut beyond the enterprise and the workers. You need a community that can do everything. You need to hyper-localize the economy within that community itself. And more broadly, you need to get people to stop thinking about themselves as workers in enterprises and more as citizens in a community, which I think is a very, very powerful idea. And if I can say, just on a personal level, this is one of my favorite ways to design an anarchist society, because the thing about anarchism is that there is no one way to do it. But if you were to set up something that could function as an anarchist society, this actually, to me, sounds very, very persuasive. Now, there are plenty of critics out there that criticize this idea. There are people who call it reformist, which is the idea that you're not actually challenging much of anything. You're just basically taking the structure that we have and reforming it, making it a little better. I am deeply unconvinced by that idea, and I'm fairly convinced that anybody who argues this has not really understood what Bookchin is arguing for, but we can talk about that in later videos as well. There are also people who come after Bookchin's strategy here, because we should say that Bookchin wants people to stand for local elections. He wants people to use the democratic process that we have now to enact political change. So his idea, roughly, is if you can take over a local assembly in a town or municipality, you can change it into a municipal structure like the one he's talking about, a hyper-local community with devolved power. Now, that may be a little bit of a step too much. Like a lot of leftists working now, I am very skeptical of this idea that you can change much operating within the current political system. However, you can be skeptical about local democratic elections, but what I do not think you should discount is the ability of people, while running for local office and actually participating in the political process, their ability to build something different, to build solidarity, to build mutual aid networks as they are using this platform. And it's one of those things where I think that as we're engaged in this struggle, basically any attempt to build solidarity and build momentum and build a movement is worth pursuing, right? For this, let 1,000 flowers bloom. But again, this is an idea we will return to later in this series when we get to it. Second thing we should talk about is the concepts, some terminology: first nature, second nature, social ecology. So Bookchin says that distinguishing humanity from nature is something that we do all the time. We love to do this, but it's a very messy distinction. And for that reason, you will come across two concepts of nature. The first nature is sort of primordial, biological, evolutionary nature. So all rooted in the biological natural world. Second nature is cultural. It's still evolutionary. It's still sort of mixed in with this evolutionary process because we are humans and we are part of nature and we evolve just as everything else. And so human society and human civilization is emergent from this evolutionary process. But culture and civilization, human civilization, are part of second nature, whereas the exclusively biological is first nature. So why do we care about this distinction? Well, it's because it allows Bookchin to come out and make his argument for what he calls social ecology. Now, social ecology, the basic idea, is that environmental devastation has nothing to do with technological progress or things like population growth. Really, environmental devastation is about the structure of society itself. So we devastate and exploit the environment because human society is structured along the lines of devastation. Things like human technology and population growth, they help to facilitate that. Sure, they're part of the equation here, but really, if you want to save the world, you have to change the bedrock upon which society is built. The next theme is going to be us talking about environmentalism versus ecology. This may sound like a little bit of a nitpicky distinction, but it is kind of important, and it's very important for Bookchin. So environmentalism for Bookchin is about protecting the environment for humans. The environment and nature becomes valuable kind of as a function of humanity. And so when we talk about things like clean air and clean water, these are really important things, but they are important because they're important to humans. Ecology, he says, is about recognizing the complex and interconnected web of things that make up nature, that include humanity, but are also worth valuing in their own right. So we don't want to protect nature because it's valuable for humanity. It is valuable for humanity, but we have to recognize nature, first nature and second nature, and their interaction as part of this larger process. And to help and allow human flourishing, we must protect the sort of environmental bedrock that we are all embedded into. And in the first few chapters, especially the first 4 chapters actually of this book, we'll get a lot more into that idea. Next theme, we have to talk about freedom. Now, freedom for Bookchin is important, and we are talking, of course, about the ecology of freedom. And that means we need to spend just a little bit of time asking ourselves, what actually is freedom? If you did a little bit of political science or intro to philosophy, stuff like that, you'll be familiar with Isaiah Berlin and the 2 concepts of freedom, positive freedom, negative freedom. Bookchin's idea of freedom is a little bit more nuanced, and it's, I think, actually very, very interesting. Bookchin says that human freedom rests on the stability of the natural ecosystem. So freedom is, yes, absolutely, freedom from hierarchy and domination, all of these things, but it's actually a bit more than that. Freedom for Bookchin is the freedom to grow, to experience our humanity differently, to develop, to live truly as humanity is meant to live, which is in the context of a social ecology. And he's going to spend a lot of this book explaining exactly what that looks like. Now let's talk a little bit about biocentrism. Now, biocentrism is the opposite of anthrocentrism, so Bookchin is kind of trying to balance these 2 things. Biocentrism is the belief that all things are equally valuable in the biological world. From the smallest microbe to the most brilliant human, all things are equal. And Bookchin says, actually, that's not quite true. This tends to be a sort of ecology that's rooted in the idea of Gaia or Mother Earth, a certain type of mysticism, and Bookchin has very little time for that. In fact, he spends a lot of time in the introduction to the 1991 edition of this book arguing against that idea, because he's been lumped in this category with mystical people who believe that Earth has a motivating force, that nature is somehow mystical and connected with things that we as humans can't access. And he is there saying essentially, no, hang on. Humans are separate from nature. There is something that distinguishes us from the rest of the natural world, and that is our ability to construct societies, to build a civilization. That is not something that we've really seen much of in the natural animal kingdom. He says just the idea that humans can value things, that humans can assign value to natural objects, makes us actually philosophically distinct from animals, which value things for their purpose and their use, but not for their whatever it is that humans use to value things. For their beauty, for their virtue, whatever. And he also takes this a step further when he says that mysticism and Gaia, often this fits neatly into the capitalist system that we have right now and can just be sort of used to sell you things. Right? This is just one more thing that can be commodified and sold to you. But on the other hand, he says, it's important not to go too far in the other direction, right? We can't just present humans as uniquely important and valuable, separate stewards and responsible for the natural world, because we are in a constant state of shared evolution. We are part of the natural world, even as we are separate from it. So Bookchin says we are both of the biological world and apart from it. And if that sounds confusing, believe me, we will get into it. The next theme we need to talk about is Bookchin's struggle with Marx, Karl Marx. So you will see Murray Bookchin throughout this book struggling with the legacy and with the ideas of Karl Marx. Marx, of course, looms very, very large over leftist thought. There is no leftist thinker out there that does not, at some point, have to engage with Marx. That it's just the rules of the game, it's how it works. But Marx is particularly annoying to Murray Bookchin for maybe 2 main reasons. And there are a number of reasons, but 2 really stand out to me as important and meriting discussion. The first thing here is that Marx saw nature, first nature, what we just set out that distinction before. Marx saw first nature as primeval wilderness that needed to be dominated, and Bookchin obviously hates that idea. We've talked about that a little bit already. But the second thing is, Marx had this idea of spontaneous revolution. You oppress the proletariat enough, and eventually the proletariat or the working class rises up and creates the conditions for revolution, and that will lead to a stateless society in the end. We will get a lot more into this idea in the series, but Bookchin doesn't think that's going to happen, hence his idea of libertarian municipalism, and this is even why Bookchin makes the argument that people should participate in democratic politics at the local level. Interesting stuff. And we should finish here with the idea of the peaceful or noble savage. Now, especially in the first chunk of this book, Bookchin is trying to answer the question of how did hierarchy come about. He has this idea that early societies, Neolithic societies, were non-hierarchical. That because there was just the notion of survival and that there was this intense connection with the natural world and not really humans apart from nature just yet, that hierarchy had to be created. And that's a really important idea because if you're trying to, as all anarchists are, if you're trying to eliminate hierarchy, you need to know how it develops in a society. And so Bookchin is doing an anthropological process to try to figure out how hierarchy emerged and then how it can be stopped. I am not an anthropologist, but that to me seems like a deeply difficult question, maybe an impossible question to answer. And it's because we just don't have the data. We just don't know enough about early Neolithic societies. We are assuming so much when we talk about the emergence of hierarchy, and especially when Bookchin talks about the emergence of hierarchy. And we will get to this later. I will make this point later in this series, but I don't know how important necessarily it is to understand the emergence of hierarchy. Of course, if we want to eliminate hierarchy, we should understand philosophically how it could come about. But to build a modern society that eliminates hierarchy when and wherever it can, it may not be completely necessary to understand the anthropological underpinnings. I will get into that idea a little bit later on. But for now, what we do need to know is that you will see Murray Bookchin at various points fall into traps that we often refer to as the peaceful or the noble savage. Now, the peaceful or the noble savage are what a lot of cultural critics like to talk about. And savage is a very loaded term that they are using consciously. But what you tend to see, especially in art and movies and TV, is a representation of early and especially Native American societies as existing in perfect harmony with the natural world. So no hierarchies beyond the chief. Everybody does their assigned role. They're very, very much in tune with the natural world around them. Think Disney's Pocahontas, right? That's what we get a lot of. And that is probably not what these early societies looked like. And Bookchin recognizes this. He talks about the early evidence of these Neolithic societies doing things like overhunting and their drive to domination. And we will talk about that a little bit when we get into I think it's the second chapter coming up. So Bookchin acknowledges this. However, he does at various points, and we will talk about this, fall into those same traps anyway. We will talk to that when we come to it, but I did want to flag this a little bit early as a potential criticism for Bookchin's anthropological work in this book. And that's the Ecology of Freedom, and I cannot wait to get into it. There is so much to discuss in this book. It is so good and so brilliant and so interesting, and there are so many things that I disagree with that he talks about, and I cannot wait to talk about them all. So, as I say, please check out the Patreon channel. That's patreon.com/Champagne Anarchism. Check out the YouTube, check out the social media, all of that. If you have thoughts, if you have comments, if there's anything major that I have missed, and of course there will be, please get in touch. You can check out the socials. You can message me directly. I am always happy to hear that. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next week for the first 2 chapters of the Ecology of Freedom. See you soon.